bringing you unique stories about Baltimore City. Our first story will be about Women's History Month. And so let's take a look at the Jewish Museum of Maryland and discuss some of the interesting Jewish women who came here to Baltimore. Our first woman of interest is Henrietta Zoll. Henrietta Zoll created the first night school in Baltimore back in the 1890s. When Jewish immigrants were coming in from Ellis Island, they had to learn English, and so Henrietta Zoll is responsible for setting up the school that taught them English. During the Nazi rule of Germany, she freed over 10,000 children that were sent to Israel. Join me now as we take you on the tour.
Of the programming. We do have a code room right around the corner.
Is there a restroom?
There is. Restrooms are just through this door. And there's also a water fountain. Sure. Yes, yes. And she's in Washington. So nice. I really want to do the chart on $7,000. It's like, oh my God, this thing is right. So what I've done is right. So what I've done is I'm going to the chart and I can pop out. This is historical figure.
This one. So can we get some?
Sure, absolutely. And you can just tell me whenever you need to get back on the bus.
Okay.
Yes. Right. So what I've done is we're going to talk today about a Jewish immigrant to Baltimore whose name was Ida Rear. My name is Deborah Card and I'm the Education Director here at the museum. And before we start, I want to just give you a little bit of the history. The first synagogue built in the state of Maryland. It was built in 1845 by a group of immigrants from Germany. And in 1960, there were plans to knock it down by the city to build a parking lot. And as you can imagine, this really got the Jewish community together. Really through a grassroots effort, the Jewish Historical Society came into being. And the first thing they did was purchase the building from the congregation that still owned it, and went about the process of preserving the building and restoring it and opening it for tours. And then in the 1980s, there was a decision to come down and build what was known as a Jewish Heritage Center, which became what you see here is a modern museum facility that was built in the mid-1980s. We decided to really expand our collections, so we now collect materials that relate to Jewish history, to American Jewish history as our primary focus, and we do have a regional focus as well. Downstairs in our basement, we have objects and collections, we have an archive, and we're going to go look at some of the materials in our archives. We have a research library that's open by appointment, a genealogist who is available to help people if they want to do some research into their families. And we also have exhibit galleries with changing exhibits, and they are open. If we have some time, you're certainly welcome to look around. And the other significant thing that happened in the 1980s is we purchased B'nai Israel, which is a synagogue right on the corner of Lombard Street and Lloyd Street. which was built in 1876 by a breakaway congregation who left the Lloyd Street Synagogue. So it's really wonderful that we have these two buildings. We lead tours through them. We serve school groups. We have public programs. We consider ourselves a very dynamic institution. We are concerned with the history of the Jewish community, but we also see ourselves really here for everyone, Jewish and non-Jewish, young and old, from diverse backgrounds. So I know that you have come here today to see two of our programs. Unfortunately, we had scheduled for you to see a performance. Unfortunately, the actor has laryngitis, so she is unable to be here. But what I've done is, the performance is part of a program we've developed called The Immigrant's Trunk. And what we have done is we have taken real life, actual people who lived in Baltimore, who were Jewish immigrants, and we're telling their stories through reproductions of materials. We've also developed some dramatic performances. And these performances are available, and this program is available for schools. We travel the chunks to schools so that it can be incorporated into a curriculum on immigration history. We also take them to senior centers. They've been very popular with senior centers. We've done them for adult groups. It's really become a wonderful way of taking our collection and making it available and accessible to the public. And it's really a way for people to learn about some people that might not have been known otherwise. We're going to look at our collections relating to a very well-known Jewish woman. Probably ever heard of. Her story is very typical of many Jewish immigrants. A lot of people really relate to her story as being something that they can relate to from their own family's history. And what's I think is really exciting is that the program was developed based on an oral history interview that a fourth grader, she was probably about 10 years old at the time, she had a Hebrew school assignment to interview somebody in her family, and she interviewed her buddy, her grandmother. And she just took simple handwritten notes on an index cards, and she compiled this beautiful scrapbook with some of her buddies' photographs, some of her family pictures. And the family thought that this was really something special, and they donated it to the museum. And when we were doing research into developing the program, we came across this beautiful scrapbook, and we used it as the basis for this program. And when we talk about that with students, we really try to get them excited about looking into their own family's history and looking at family photographs and talking to people and finding out where their families came from and some exciting stories from them. So what do we know about Ida, and how can we tell her story through her granddaughter's project? This is the earliest photograph we have of Ida. I'm going to be able to pass everything around. Here we see her standing in the back. She's standing with her brothers and sisters. She was born in a tiny village in Ukraine, which was then a part of really the Russian Empire. She was born in the 1880s, and she lived in what was known as a shtetl, which was where the Jews of Eastern Europe were forced to live. I have a map of the Pale of Settlement, which, based on laws that were passed in the Russian Empire, Jews were really forced to live in areas within these boundaries. They could live in cities like Kiev, but also in smaller towns, which were known as shtetls. Her father was a rabbi of the town, and he was also the shochet, which meant that he was responsible for the ritual slaughtering of animals. She had a very tight-knit family, and she already, by the time that picture was taken, she had a sister, an older sister named Minnie, and an uncle Louis, who had already made the voyage to America and had settled in Baltimore. Now, as we know, the late 1800s, the early 1900s were a period of upheaval for Jews living in Eastern Europe, and it was also a great period of migration for these individuals. They came over to America in large numbers during this time. And the reason for this, as most of you I'm sure know, is that there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in this part of Europe. The Tsar at the time, Alexander III, implemented pogroms against Jews. There was forced conscription of Jewish men into the Russian army. So people were looking for better times, for a better place, and there were these wonderful stories about the United States.
So I mean, this sounds very naive because I just didn't realize it, but it really sounds like the anti-Semitism, even persecution, if you look at that far, happened a long time before Hitler.
Absolutely. And the roots are so deep. Even before this, one of the things that There's really, Jews were, there were periods of time when they were accepted and could live with their non-Jewish neighbors, but really from early times there were always, this unsettled feeling of you never knew who was going to come into power, whether your rights would be taken away, where you would be forced to live, what kinds of jobs you could have. So you're absolutely right. The historical roots for that anti-Semitism go back extraordinary into history. And a lot of Jews finally decided they couldn't take it anymore. It was time to leave. Now we do know that this was one of the things that Ida took with her. If the family raised enough money, they decided they had enough money to send one more person. Her older sister was living here to live in the United States. Her father would not leave. I have a picture. Here's a picture you can see of her family. Here's her father and her mother seated with her siblings. He felt he was needed. He was the rabbi of the town. He needed to stay. Ida was the oldest at the time, the oldest sibling, so her sister sent some money that she had saved working as a seamstress in a factory, and they decided that she would go. She traveled to the United States with another family, and we know that the journey was a very difficult one. She traveled by train to the port city of Bremen in Germany, and from there caught a ship to the United States. We have reproduced some tags that give us a sense of what the journey was like to the United States. This, for instance, did not belong to Ida. This is another example from our collections. This is a tag that was worn as a way of identifying the passengers. All the immigrants traveled in third class. I'm sure you've heard the stories. They were in steerage, the bottoms of the ships, crammed into these tiny little cabins with berths that went up about 3 or 4 high. When Ida talked to her granddaughter, she talked about how she was shoved into this compartment with thousands of people, and she was a girl from a little town of 200, and hearing all the different languages, and there was a lot of seasickness, and it was certainly not pleasant. It took several weeks to get across the ocean. And then she arrived in Locust Point in Baltimore, which was Baltimore's port of entry, which is located right around the harbor. Of course, many more Jews arrived at Ellis Island in New York, and we talk a lot about Ellis Island. And one of the ways that people, when we do history into family history, one of the things people look for are what's known as ship manifests. On the ships, the ship captains had to keep track of the names of every single passenger. They were handwritten in these ledgers, and there were all kinds of information that they needed to know about their passengers. They needed to know their names, their age, where they were born, their occupation, whether they could read or write. And one of the most exciting things when we were doing research is we were able to locate the ship manifest that shows Ida's name. Her name in Ukraine was Razumna, that was the family name, and her first name was Chaya, which is a Jewish name, which means life. We know that she had already changed her name when she got on board to Rosen, which was the name that her sister and uncle had already adopted, which was a more American sounding name. And we found her listed here, and again, this is something that you can pass around and look at. It's a highlighted name. We found her, which was very exciting, so that we could pinpoint her date of arrival to 1913 in Baltimore on a ship called the Frankfurt. We know that she had $5 in her pocket when she arrived. That's noted there. And also she tells us where she was going to live. Single women coming to America had to have somebody, either meeting them at the ship, they had to have somebody, they couldn't just come by themselves. So the ship captains had to report who it was going to be responsible. And in Ida's case, it was her sister Minnie. Now we don't know we don't know exactly when Ida's name got changed from Chaya to Ida. There are all kinds of stories of people when they arrived being forced to change their names, whether it was that the person taking their information didn't understand their name, so that could be one of the reasons. These were how immigrants were identified. They were forced to wear these tags that showed the place on the manifest where their name could be found. So in this case, this person was on the manifest page number 33, the list number 4. So you can only imagine, I mean, people were really reduced to numbers. It was, people talk about the process as being, very much like herded like cattle. There were long lines. You had to go through a series of medical examinations. It was certainly a very rigorous process, and that's one of the things that when our actor does a performance is she really captures that sense of fear of arriving and not really wanting to go forward, but not going back either, and how she went forward, met her sister, and went to live in a house on South Bond Street, which was not very far from here. This neighborhood, it's just amazing the transformation it's going through right now, but at one time this was really a hub of Jewish life here in Baltimore.
I want to say something. My grandfather came over in 1905, escaping anti-Semitism in what's now Poland. It was very useful. We were able at Ellis Island to track down not the whole manifest, but the ship listing, and everyone was listed from their country of origin. They were Polish, German, Russian, except my grandfather and anyone else that said Hebrew. Didn't matter what country they came from.
And that is you can see that it's listed there for Ida as well. I think that's an excellent point.
People and Russian.
It's just Hebrew.
So right now we're going through this, hopefully, rebirth, and we don't know what this neighborhood will look like. We're very excited. But when Ida lived here, back in the early 1900s, this was really a thriving Jewish community. All along Lombard Street, where you might notice that there are still a few delis. It was really the commercial center of the neighborhood. There were tailor shops, butcher shops, kosher bakeries, delis, push carts. It was a very colorful market known as the Yiddish market, because that was the language that so many that really unified the Jewish immigrants. They spoke Yiddish, they dressed differently. It was really very similar to New York's Lower East Side was right here. There were also a lot of synagogues. And actually here is a map that just gives you some point of reference to where Ida's life and all the things that took place. You can see here's Lucas Point. Here's the house where she lived with her uncle Louis and Minnie. She went to work, as many immigrants did, in a factory that was a Jewish-owned factory. At this time, Baltimore was really the center of the garment district. And what's interesting is that a lot of the factories were owned by German Jews who had settled earlier and who had really quickly assimilated and risen up the ranks. And then they employed a lot of the new immigrants from Eastern Europe. So Ida went to work at the Saunders factory, which is a very well-known factory here on Paca and Redwood Street. She made men's lapels. And one of the things I think that was very frustrating for her, which she talked to her granddaughter about, was that she was forced to work on Saturdays, which of course is, for the daughter of a rabbi, that was a huge compromise for her. And she went home to her Uncle Louis and said, how can I do this? How can I do this? And he told her, Ida, this is America. And the owner of the factory said, if you want a job on Monday, you've got to come on Saturday. So you see a lot of these tensions about, wanting to maintain your Jewish identity. And in the trunk, we've included some things that talk a little bit about Ida's Jewish identity. Her family she did bring over a menorah, not this one, but kind of similar to this. Because we talk about sort of this tension that here a lot of Jews were coming because they thought they would have these opportunities to practice their religion freely, and certainly they could, but there was also these expectations that they would assimilate, which was a difficult thing. We also know that Ida attended the night school here in East Baltimore that was started by Henrietta Zold, and we'll learn a little bit more about that when we go in the library, which was a really wonderful institution, and it's where a lot of Eastern European Jews came to learn English and to study for their citizenship exams. She got married in the 1920s. Here's a picture of her wedding. You can see she's got this really beautiful American West-style wedding dress. She married a Jewish immigrant from Austria named Daniel Rear. And one of the things that, one of the photographs that we put together shows that she sent a wedding invitation to her family. And here we see her family back in Ukraine at this time, who of course could not come for her wedding, but went to a photography studio and had themselves a picture taken of them holding the wedding invitation and then sent it back to her. I mean, it's really started. I think it was 1922, I believe. But it's just the contrast between these two photographs. You can really see, even from the early photograph, just how things have really changed and how her siblings have aged so dramatically, and how you can really tell that times have not treated her very well. If you look these two up together. Another thing that her family donated to the museum is this wonderful wedding blessing. Her father was also something of an artist, and he created this beautiful wedding blessing that he sent to the couple. And what's interesting is because he didn't have a photograph of either her husband, he used photographs of her sisters, Lottie and her husband, and then attached it to it. But the prayer is written in Hebrew. It's kind of an interesting piece, and the reproduction doesn't give you the sense, but there's a vial for some of the wedding wine. There's a place where they can put some of their wedding cake, which you can still see. And it's really a beautiful blessing, and tells us, it gives us evidence that there was communication between her and her family. Sadly, she lost communication with her family, and it was only later that she learned that all but a sister had perished in the Holocaust. And her family actually tells us this really heart-wrenching story about how she and her sister Minnie had raised money to bring them over. But with the stock market crash, they lost all their money. So it's really a very sad story. One of the wonderful things is I've since connected with her daughter, who's living here, who lives here in Baltimore, and her granddaughter, and the family has been very involved in helping us put this together, which has been very rewarding. And Ida and Daniel in many ways lived the typical life of sort of that first generation Jewish immigrant. They, together, they opened a store on Light Street down there where the Science Center is today. So that's really where they started. They lived above the store, as so many people did. They then, once their business was doing better, they moved out to the suburbs around Drew Hill Park, and Daniel took the streetcar downtown to work. They raised 3 children, 3 very American children. One was Aaron Jerome, a second was Dorothy, the third was Elaine, and 2 of the siblings are still alive today. Dorothy, her daughter, talks about how they did not teach their kids Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish to themselves, but they taught their kids English. They wanted them to really be American from the beginning. And I forgot to hand out one of the nice things that we also have is we have Ida and Daniel's. This one is Daniel's third naturalization papers, which, as you can imagine, must have been a real sense of pride for them. That we also used to talk a little bit about the naturalization process back in this time. Dorothy survived, Ida survived Daniel by about 20 years. And I have some really wonderful older photographs of her. She lived until the age of 92 and was really a very vital presence in her family's life. She lived, I believe, until 1988.
Do you know the occupation of the children?
The children, Dorothy is married. Her husband, they owned a business together, a store where I believe they sold almost like a drugstore. I don't know the occupation of the other 2, but that certainly would be interesting. And Minnie also has some grandchildren who I had the opportunity to meet as well. The other things we put in the trunk that we use with children with students, with all groups really, are objects that they can handle to really learn a little bit more about this time period. We have some clothes that they can try on. We have some things to give them a sense of what daily life was like for women, and try to get them figure out what some of these things are. Think about doing laundry before the days of a washing machine. And there's a heavy cast iron skillet and an iron, just to give them a sense of what the everyday life would be like for a female Jewish immigrant at this time. Are there any questions or anything else you'd like to say?
I have a question. With that tag and riding is that the ship that she sailed?
That was not hers. We don't have any material. So what we've done is we put some things together that we just feel give a much fuller sense. In another trunk we've got a third class boarding ticket that we've reproduced in a meal card that immigrants used on the ship.
We now have statistics where we know what came in versus New York on maybe 4 or 5 years of the period between. But, easily we're in the top 3 or 4.
That's great to know.
But the story of being number, that's That's one of Dean's projects now, is to get away from saying that.
Oh, well, that's
Yeah.
good to know, thank you.
What are the other two cities in it? Was
Boston
Boston.
was another one. I'm trying to think of the third one, whether it was Philadelphia, I'm not sure, but in a couple of years, we were.
Okay, so there you have it, in a couple of years we can say.
So occasionally.
And one of the real cores of their outreach is these series of traveling trunks. So what we have done, we've done it a little bit differently, but they are available to rent, so that a school can call us and we can ship the trunk to them for a period of 3 weeks. It comes complete with a full curricular binder. It's got about 5 lesson plans in it. There's a lot of background material so that the teacher can use it by him or herself. We also can make a staff person or volunteer available to come and lead one of the lesson plans. They can also book a living history performance to come to the school. But we also use it here on site as well with visiting groups.
What's the cost of rent?
The cost to rent, I believe, is $55 for a 3-week rental.
Also, the Baltimore Jewish Community Jewish Council also will provide names of Holocaust survivors and will come talk to the school. They've gone as far as Allegheny counties.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, folks, I hope you're enjoying the tour, and we'll be right back after station break.